Hi, I'm Chris. This is Finding God at Work. Just a reminder that Finding God at Work isn't just a podcast, it's also an online course. Check it out at findinggodatwork.org. Our current series is Divine Disappointments, Facing Pain and Sorrow at Work. And today we have the privilege of speaking with Meryl Herr, who has recently written a book called When Work Hurts, Building Resilience When You're Beat Up or Burnt Out. And Meryl, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks, Chris.
One of the things I love about your book is that you talk about a broad range of work experiences. I know that right now you're the owner of a consulting firm called the GoodWorks Group, and that specializes in educational program planning and evaluation, things like that. You used to be at the Max Pree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary, but you've also done a variety of things throughout your career, which I think has been super helpful for providing illustrative stories in the book. But you also interviewed a lot of different people about their experiences with work, so it's a really rich kind of panoply of vocational settings. But before we dig into that and some of your work experience, I like to start with the question, how do you find God at work? What's helpful for you in an everyday work day to welcome the presence of God?
That's really good. So I have the privilege of working for myself and from home. And so that gives some agency and autonomy over my time and choices that I might not have in a different work environment. But I do try to spend some time in the scriptures most mornings before I am starting work. And it's not perfect. It's not always every day at the same time for the same amount of time. But typically that is just, slowly reading through a book of the Bible. Sometimes I will listen to the scriptures while I'm on a walk or taking the dog out. But just starting my day there, listening, especially if there is any kind of invitation for me for that day. And even as an example, I'm reading First Corinthians right now. And just the other day, I had 4 meetings on the docket three on the docket, ended up having 4. It was going to be a really big day in terms of strategy, trying to help some clients move forward on some projects. And they had hired me as the expert there, but I had to say some hard things to some of them, right, to get them going in a different direction. And I got to Paul saying, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And I felt like there was such a gentle whisper for me that morning. So I even wrote it at the top of my planner that, like, let that be the orientation this week. So that's a practice that is really important to me.
When you have to deliver some tough love communication, First Corinthians is the place to be in the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
So that seems like a fortuitous timing of God leading you to that too. But yeah, that verse is so convicting, right? We can, especially those of us who work with ideas, we can get puffed up really easily.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, for sure.
So turning to the topic of work, we're mainly going to spend our time talking about toxic workplaces, which you have a chapter about in the book. And just real quick mentioning the book, I, being a podcaster, sometimes I read a book because I have to. But this was one of those experiences where as I was reading it because I had to, I was like, this is amazing. This is great. I'm so glad I read this book just for me. So thank you for writing a really wonderful book. But before we talk about toxic workplaces writ large, I was just curious about an experience you share early in the book where you had a pretty significant experience of disillusionment while you were working as a teacher at a Christian school. Could you share about that?
Yeah. So this is really early in my career. I was in my mid-20s, had just gotten married, and needed to find a full-time job, and got a job teaching middle school math at a private Christian school. And there were so many things I loved about the job. It was a great fit. I loved working with the kids. There were some really hard aspects of the job, just, not having a lot of money because they didn't have a great budget for us. I had a ton of different classes to prep for every day. And so at times felt really overwhelmed. But I think one of the most challenging pieces was having to interact with the parents at the school. So the school at the time only went through eighth grade. And so all of the students would be going to different high schools and some of the top high schools in our area. And when you're a math teacher, that means you have to think about the students' placements in their math programs in high school and make recommendations. And I remember like some parents just getting really nasty towards me during those moments. And when I'm trying to make a professional judgment about what's best for their student, whom I see in class every single day. And, they're like, well, if my child doesn't take XYZ class, you're ruining their future because they're not going to get into Harvard. And that was really tough. And I remember there was another parent that just treated me really poorly from the
Hmm.
get-go. I mean, I think it started with one time like I forgot to reply to an email and that just really made her mad. There was no grace for being a new teacher and trying to figure it out. And then just throughout the year, she would yell at me, sometimes in front of her child. And it got to the point where I had to have an administrator present with me anytime that parent wanted to interact with me. And I just was like, oh, well, I thought I was in a Christian school. Like I thought everybody was going to be nice and Christianly, right? And I don't, is
Yeah.
Christianly a word? But no, I mean, it was just really broken. And I was like, I had these assumptions going in that were totally busted. And so that was a really interesting time, early in my career and life, really, of trying to figure out, well, how do I have to readjust those assumptions and keep on working in light of the fact that things aren't the way I thought they were?
Yeah. Yeah. That I have a lot of friends who became teachers after college because I was also an education major, although my career took a different course. And the stories about sometimes things outside of the classroom being the most difficult to deal with, like parent conversations.
Mm-hmm.
It really can be overwhelming what teachers face.
Mm-hmm.
And for many of them, and it sounds like for you too, it's so much the harder because teaching wasn't just a job. It was a sense of this was something I had high hopes for. This was something that I felt gifted for. This was something spiritually meaningful. But then the reality feels so different.
Oh yeah, and I think it's really hard in the helping professions, especially, right? Because you're going in with a heart to serve other people and to make a difference. And then when you're just getting flack and feel like you can do no right, it's really tough. But I think it's given me a lot of compassion. Every time I have to email my children's teachers now, I am like, oh, I hope I'm not coming across like those parents came across to me. So even had to email a teacher this morning. We're a week into school and ask about something. And I'm like, I don't want to create burden for her. But how can I raise an issue and offer to be a collaborator in solving it instead of being nasty and rude? So,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh. Well, as we think about toxic workplaces in general, I know one thing that you cited in your book was a study that kind of looked at the different aspects of toxic workplaces. I think this was from the MIT Sloan Management Review. So it said that the top 5 characteristics were such workplaces are disrespectful, non-inclusive, unethical, cutthroat, and abusive. So even in your story, like facing the verbal abuse essentially of that parent,
mhm,
even though it wasn't a colleague, that was part of your work environment.
yeah.
And you found in the scriptures a kind of similar scenario where there were people facing something from the outside, but that was creating this effect in their work environment in the book of Nehemiah. So I found that parallel really intriguing. And sort of, what struck you about that story as being similar to toxic workplaces?
Yeah, so I'll give our listeners a little bit of the backstory if they haven't been in Nehemiah in a while. But we're talking about the period that is at the end of the Babylonian exile. So Jerusalem has been sieged by the Babylonians, and essentially burned to the ground, and many of the people of Judah have been taken off into exile, and now they're beginning to return and rebuild. And they're in the book of Nehemiah, especially, they're rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem, which fortified the city. But one of the things that's a major obstacle for them in the rebuilding is the political adversaries that are in their environment. And so there are these different political actors that actually start taunting and threatening the people of God who are trying to work on the wall. And so they get to the point where they're feeling so threatened. And we're not just talking like word jeers. I mean, they're doing, like, verbal assaults at them, but they actually are threatening violence against them at one point. And so we have this image in Nehemiah of God's people building the wall with one hand while holding a sword with another. Right? It's just this fantastic, I mean, terrible and fantastic
Yeah.
image of what it is really like to work in a toxic workplace, because you're trying to do something really good and meaningful with your defenses up the whole time. And how much energy that takes. I mean, how much more work could you get done if you're actually building with two hands? And instead, you have one hand building and one hand trying to stay safe. And I think that's what it's like for a lot of people in a toxic workplace, because you might have these emotional defenses up, or other kinds of barriers, just trying to protect yourself and make it through the day.
Yeah. It's such a powerful image, and I can think of times in my work life where it's like, oh yeah, half of my mental energy is going to worrying about how my boss is going to react to my work, not not free. That mental energy isn't free to just do the work.
Hmm.
And so then, that's like holding that sword.
Hmm.
You cited a scholar named Albert O. Hirschman, who had a work from the 1970s where he kind of talked about, to use our analogy, what it's like to hold that sword and kind of what your options
Hmm.
are. And so you kind of looked at these four options when you're dissatisfied with your employer or your work environment: to exit, to voice, to express loyalty, or to neglect. Can you just talk about what those four options are?
Yeah.
Exit, voice, loyalty, and neglect.
Yeah, so I love this framework because it's so helpful. And one of the things, before I jump into it, one of the things that I've been thinking about, as encouraging people to think through this framework, is that a lot of what we're going to talk through here kind of sounds like a flight or fight mechanism, which is, our response, our kind of our automatic response to dangerous situations. What I think here is something more measured and more calculated. So we're in a little bit more of a like regulated state, can see more clearly, may have counsel from other people helping us make this decision. So I want to give that little caveat. So exit. If you are in a certain type of environment that's toxic, you may need to leave. And that's not always a choice for everyone, but leaving could look like quitting, or it could look like putting in a request to transfer to a different department. But you're trying to exit that really toxic environment. Voice is where you're going to stay in the toxic environment and use your voice for change and try to be an advocate where you can. Loyalty is where you decide that, yes, the workplace may be toxic, but I personally am really committed to the mission of the organization, to what we're doing in the world. And so I'm going to just tough it out because I care so much about what I'm doing or what the organization's doing. And neglect is where you're just like, I'm just going to like kind of be here and phone it in every day. I think that's most akin to quiet quitting, which is what we've seen more recently in the news. And what's interesting is I don't think these are four discrete options. So
Hmm.
I think sometimes you could do more than one at the same time. So you could be looking for an exit, and while you're waiting for that exit to come about, advocate for change and exercise your voice. I think you could probably exercise your voice while staying committed through loyalty. And so as I think through these options, I think the one that is probably the one that Christians maybe should stay away from considering is neglect. As I understand the scriptures and think about how we're called to work as unto the Lord, I don't see how neglect fits into that framework. So I would caution a Christian about engaging in neglect. But there may be some healthy sense in which you do need to like pull back a little bit. Maybe you're not giving 110% all the time. Maybe you're giving 95, and that's out of self-preservation, right? Because you are keeping your defenses up. But like dialing back to 50 to 75% probably isn't the answer because your employer could notice and you could get fired. You could lose the opportunity of getting a good recommendation. I just don't find that to be a really fruitful way forward.
Sure, sure. Yeah. And well, and that brings up too, like maybe that drive to give 110% is more internal than the actual what's necessary for the job.
Yeah.
And like for me, I've struggled with that. And meeting with a counselor, he was like, Chris, it seems like you feel like you have to hit it out of the park every single day. And what if it's okay to have an off day?
Mm-hmm.
And just learning like, oh, maybe I'm contributing to my own toxic work environment
Oh,
internally,
yeah.
in that sense. Another way that you talk about how our internal attitude can kind of drive things is that sense of calling,
Mm-hmm.
and how it can kind of be a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
So could you talk more about that? How does calling help? And then how could calling actually, or a sense of calling, maybe hurt when we're in a toxic work environment?
Yeah, this is great and actually comes out some early research on calling and how people bring a sense of calling to work. And it's been continued to have been built on over the last several years. But the original research found that having a sense of calling in like to a particular type of work or that helps you think purposefully about an occupation gives you a lot of motivation, a lot of energy. There's also a lot of research that indicates that employees that have a sense of calling to a particular type of work may be more engaged, have higher job satisfaction, and can even be more productive. So, I mean, lots of positive benefits of having a sense of calling as it relates to your work. But we're also finding that sometimes you may be so committed to that calling that you may stay in something when you should exit. So
Hmm.
you may stay in a role where you're being harassed, right, out of a sense of calling. Now, as I understand calling, and I talk about this in the book, I understand our calling as something that's bigger. It transcends an individual job. And so, in that kind of understanding of calling, I think liberates us from saying, I have to stay in this job because I'm called to it. Well, you could maybe called to something that you're doing through that job, but maybe you could do that same thing somewhere else where you're not being abused or harassed or exploited. Because at some point we get like diminishing returns, right? If we stay in these really awful environments, because it's not just that they are emotionally painful, they start to affect our health and our well being, our other relationships, because we're burnt out or carrying some kind of trauma. So it's not like our work happens in this box that's isolated from the rest of our lives. We're whole people enmeshed in really big complex systems. And so even if one aspect of our work is going awry, it can affect everything else. So when we're in a toxic situation, we really need to be prayerful and wise and think in community with other people. Is this a wise course of action? And I love a book that I've been reading. I'm gonna probably have to look and see if it's on my desk. It is by Oh goodness, I shouldn't have to feel this way. Yeah, Allison Cook. Sorry, I had to look and see the title on my desk. It wasn't coming to mind, but she has an interesting framework in that book that it really reminds me of this exit voice, loyalty, neglect. But talks about, difficult situations that, yeah, sometimes you need to leave them, sometimes you need to stay and fight for change. But she has this language of suffer wisely
Mm.
as a piece. And I'm like, oh, I wish I'd had that when I was writing the book, right? To call out, like, what a great piece of wisdom there. When is God calling me to suffer wisely? And again, that's not something that we discern by ourselves. It requires prayer, it requires community, people who love us helping to see that, because sometimes they may see that your work is completely destroying you and you think you're okay. Maybe that's
Yeah.
not suffering wisely at that point.
I love that language that we do face suffering as disciples of Jesus, but we need to exercise wisdom and not just fall into foolish suffering that isn't fruitful, that isn't honoring to God. And that discernment may lead us to exit or to voice or to remain in the loyalty option, depending on what God is doing in a given circumstance. I wish we had more time to keep going with all of this, but I think my listeners will appreciate the commute length podcast staying to that length. So just as a final note, I just want to read this wonderful quote from one of the final pages of your book. This is from your chapter, Working in the New Jerusalem. You wrote, "With God's help, we can move from the ash heap and rubble of our work hurt to become rebuilders, renewers, repairers, and restorers in this broken world." So I just love that image. Also, obviously, from Nehemiah of rebuilding the wall, that when we welcome God, even in a toxic workplace, he can minister through us to be repairers. So I was wondering, could you just conclude in prayer for our listeners to have that experience with whatever they're facing?
Yeah, for sure. God in heaven, we thank you for the opportunity to work in whatever way that is. Sometimes that is paid, sometimes it's unpaid, sometimes it's seen, very visible, very prominent, sometimes it's very quiet and hidden. But you have created us for work, and so we give thanks for the opportunity to shine your light through our work in the world. But and we have experienced that work can be really painful, that it is often not the way that you have designed it to be. And so for those folks who are listening who find themselves in difficult work environments, would you first and foremost comfort them with your presence, give them hope that you are working beyond what they could dream or imagine. God, and would you be their peace? Give them wisdom to know if they need to suffer wisely or to move on to something different. But all in all, we trust that you are using your people in the world to bring about restoration and renewal for the sake of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks for listening. Finding God at Work is a production of Mission Central, a ministry based in Aurora, Illinois, dedicated to forming Christians for mission in everyday life. You can subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to this episode to get 10 minutes of teaching on faith and work every Tuesday and Thursday. To get resources to go deeper with each podcast series, read our blog, and get info about upcoming courses on faith in the workplace, go to our website, missioncentral.church.